Thank you. Welcome to the SIB-NL Congress on Digital Freedom and Women's Rights. I will briefly explain the schedule. We will have 2 sessions. The first session will be on digital freedom, and we will have 3 speakers in total. The Q&A will be after each presentation, so if you could please ask your questions after the presentation, that would be wonderful. And then we will have a lunch break where food and drinks will be at the back. However, please remain seated before you're indicated to go, just so that we run things a bit smoother. Then we will move on to our second session on freedom and women's rights, where we will again have 3 speakers. However, the Q&A will take place at the end after all the speakers have spoken. It will be a more interactive nature. And then with that, we conclude. Thank you, first of all, to the speakers for giving up your valuable time and speaking to us here today. And now I would like to give the floor to the chair of SIB-Amsterdam, Willem.
Good morning. Welcome to the Dutch United Nations Student Association Congress here in Amsterdam. Welcome to the Vondelkerk. Today's Congress is part of our Lustrum Week. We celebrate SIB-Amsterdam's 40th anniversary. A Lustrum year, so we have some good preparations behind us for this week, as it's full of activities. For us, it's a milestone where we reflect on beautiful memories, of course, also a difficult year, but also looking ahead with excitement for SIB-Amsterdam, but also for the other SIB cities, of course. Today's date, July 1st, is also another milestone. Today, we commemorate and celebrate Ketty Kotti, the day on which slavery in Suriname and the Dutch Antilles was abolished. A step forward in terms of freedom for African people who were forced to work there and people from African descending. But we also know that this fight towards freedom, this fight for racism and discrimination is not over yet. All the more reason to talk about freedom today, which we will do with you here. Freedom has been on all our minds a lot, of course, over the last 1.5 years. Who could have imagined that we were forced to stay at home and isolate from each other? And who could have imagined that we would have a curfew again for the first time since World War II? Well, I did not, for sure. Though we still live in a relatively free country, I think we're all quite aware that we're lucky with that, as there's still conflict in the Middle East, oppression in many Asian countries, and peoples around the world are terrorized by terrorism and other dangers. So we realize this, but we also, with the experience of last year, we think it's a good moment to reflect on what freedom actually means. And then there's, of course, also some terms and some sorts of freedoms that we also still have to deal with and that we did not achieve ourselves yet. We will talk about 2 of those today, women's rights and freedom in the digital age. We chose these topics based on our own interests and things that we see happening around us. Of course, with women's rights, many things have happened over the last 1.5 years. Public discussions come up. And of course, with the digital age, that's something we're going to have to deal with much more in the coming years. So I think it's important to talk about freedom and its impact on the digital age as well. We will do so with guest speakers. Some of them are here already. We'll receive 3 more later today, which is really interesting, I think, today. And we will discuss with them these themes in the spirit of SIB, where we like to combine social activities together with intellectual activities. We do so again today, where we try to learn from each other, and that way also resemble a step forward in terms of freedom for ourselves. So I hope you enjoyed today, that you learn from the speakers, learn from each other. I suggest that you write down questions you may have, as indeed Q&A sessions are at the end, and for myself, I always tend to forget what exactly it was that I was having a question about during a presentation. So do that, and let's get some interesting discussions going today. But above all, enjoy. Welcome to Amsterdam.
Thank you, Willem. I would now like to introduce Rogier Kremers, if you would like to come up here. He is at the University of Leiden, an assistant professor in modern Chinese studies with a background in sinology and relations. During his presentation, he will argue that China's approach to the internet was based on a far more accurate assessment of the impact of digital technology than the West, and thus allowed it to become a thought leader on numerous issues. and hopefully he will provide a very thought-provoking presentation. Thank you, Rogier. You have the floor.
Thank you very much, everyone, and it's wonderful to be here instead of in my house behind a computer with tracksuit bottoms. It is indeed a wonderful day of celebrations. If you are, for instance, interested in the deliverance of Dutch-held slaves, but you will forgive me, given my speciality, that I would like to focus your attention to another anniversary, either through intent or happenstance. This event has been organized today on what is the 100th anniversary of the foundation of the Chinese Communist Party. You may have already seen on the morning news the big extravaganza that took place on Tiananmen Square earlier today, the triumphant speech of General Secretary Xi Jinping, who completed the first centenary objective of the Chinese Communist Party's process for modernization, and declared open the effort to achieve its next centenary objective, and that is becoming a fully modernized country by October 1st, 2049, which is, of course, the 100th anniversary of the establishment of the People's Republic itself. So a very symbolic day, I think, a little bit to talk about the internet, to talk about digital freedoms. This morning, fairly early, I was already up in front of my computer with tracksuit bottoms as I was doing an interview for a foreign broadcaster. And obviously, the first question you get is, where is China now where it comes to freedom of expression? I see there are some people who are really happy with the fact that the party made it to 100 years, some exuberance there. And my first response to these notions is the problem, or one problem already lies in the assumption. We have come to understand freedom of expression as a sort of natural existence, and anything and any place where it does not exist is a sort of aberration. And it is this sort of mental architecture that I would like to address and, in fact, challenge today. Not in order to make the Chinese Communist Party's case for it. It's got 90 million members. There are, in fact, more Communist Party members in China than there are Germans in Germany. It clearly has the human power and the resources to do that for itself. But more because I believe that we have become intellectually complacent over the last couple of decades. And in order to maintain those ideas and those ideals that we hold dear, complacency is luxury that I believe we can no longer afford. So I speak to you today not just as an area specialist, but also as a concerned citizen who believes that we must do a better job. And I will try and outline exactly where and how I do believe we can and should do that better job. And so what I'd like to do in two parts is first work a little bit through, when China looks at the digital space, what does it see? And how is that vision of the digital space a reflection of long-held ideas, long-held ideologies, perspective, worldviews about history, about human existence, about the nature, about human nature, and about the role of politics? And on that basis, I will then try and be a little bit thought-provoking in relation to where Chinese sources of success come from, and where that poses a challenge to some dominant ideas that we have long held. And I hope then to be able to discuss some of these with you. One of the things that we very often forget when we look at China is that China is indeed a Leninist country. And very many of my ex-Sovietologist colleagues believe that they could throw away their textbooks on Leninist political thought when the Soviet Union disappeared. Turns out they are coming in pretty useful today. But so the problem with that is that many students of politics, including myself when I did my international relations idea, we no longer get courses in comparative ideologies. And so very often we lack the words to explain or to understand the way that different political systems, different political ideologies are constructed. And I'm using the word ideology fairly deliberately here, because I think it is crucial. Now, very often the problem with the word ideology is that we use it in a pejorative sense, right? When it is the opposite of rationality. When someone is acting ideologically, essentially we're saying that they're being stupid, right? Now, I today would like to use the word ideology in a fairly different sense, in a more neutral sense, if that's the word that I'm looking for, but at least a sense where ideology refers to a arrangement, a collection of ideas, assumptions, values that, on the one hand, explain to us the world as it is, and on the other hand, tell us how and why the world should change. In other words, ideology is both analytical and normative, right? It tells us why the world around us is the way it is, and it tells us what and how, what needs to change and how it needs to change. And the reason for that, in the end, is fairly simple. Very many people would like to believe that as human beings, we are rational utility maximizers or any other sort of robotic Homo economicus-based view of human nature. We are not. We are storytelling monkeys. And we've gone quite far with brains that developed essentially to throw rocks at the monkeys in the next tree down. We have put someone on the moon after all. But in the end, human beings make sense of the world through stories. And so ideologies are the stories we tell to ourselves for our puny little monkey brains to give some meaning to and make some sense of a world that is otherwise far too complex for us to comprehend. Now, what is the Chinese ideology and how does the digital space fit in there? The Chinese Communist Party ideology, as it stands today, is a curious hybrid which inherits both elements of China's past, classical imperial thought, sometimes called Confucianism, but a classically trained sinologist will get very angry if you call it Confucianism. And in fact, it's not a very helpful label, but just, so you know what we're talking about. I call it classical imperial thought. And ideas that were introduced in China's long crisis that started in the mid-19th century and, at least in the eyes of the Communist Party, lasted until 1949. And so what you have there is the breakdown of that traditional architecture, both in terms of thought as well as in terms of political structures and processes. We no longer have the Chinese Empire. And so what really happens is the search is on for new ideas to help China modernize. And this is one thing that we really, really need to understand. The China that we see today was born in the ashes of the Opium War, was born in the ashes of the empire, was born in the ashes of foreign imperial presence, right? Here, with China, for perhaps the first time in history, we start to see a country achieve global power status that was a loser in the colonial era, that was a subject of colonization, right? And yes, we can talk about the United States starting out as a colony or Australia start out as a colony, but I think I think you understand the meaning that I'm trying to get across. So what really happened during that curious period of intellectual foment today, 100 years ago, was that ideas were tested with regard to their utility of how they could help China re-achieve that position of wealth and strength that it had in the past, at least in its Asian region, and that it would very much like to re-attain. And obviously, the first thing they tried was liberal democracy, after the empire fell at least. Now that collapsed pretty quickly. There are many reasons for that I'm afraid I can't go into here today. And then they tried out military-led republicanism, which lasted until 1949. But in 1929, we see the establishment of a communist party. Communist party organized, obviously, along Marxist tenets. Now, something that I very often do with my students then is I ask them what Marxism is. And perhaps tragically, very many of them don't know. And I get sort of, is it a little bit about oppression of the working class, which obviously, some of it, some of the more righty-wingy will, throw in ideas about cultural Marxism, which is deeply regrettable. That's then really the point where one has to explain that in the end, Marxism is a theory of history. What Marxism does is it claims to be a social scientific theory that identifies stages of historical progress on the basis of economic relationships between those who own or hold different factors of production. And obviously, Marx wrote during what he called the capitalist stage, and then the idea is that capitalism will collapse under its own internal contradictions. We will then get a socialist stage, and then we end up at a communist stage, and that communist stage is very much a utopian ideal where we will produce so much that we won't even need to think about issues of distribution anymore, because everyone can have what they like. This is where Marxism is strangely neoliberal. And that actually fitted on really well with an idea of moral utopia that was very much present in traditional imperial thought. And that's the idea that the task of a ruler was to emulate the virtue of the great sage kings of the past, and through emulating that virtue, re-attain that golden age of these sage kings. So Chinese ideas of a moral utopian future combined with Marxist ideas of an economic utopian future. A moral utopian future of social harmony, where everyone knows their place and therefore there is no social conflict or political conflict. An economic utopia where we are so wealthy that we don't even need to think about distribution anymore, therefore no economic conflict. The only problem with Marxism as a theory of history is it doesn't really tell us how history is supposed to progress. Enter stage left Vladimir Ilyich Lenin. And what Lenin argues is the revolution isn't going to take care of itself. It isn't going to happen automatically. What you need for the revolution is a professional cadre organized in a party that forms the vanguard of the nation, that has a solid command of Marxist theory, but also a solid command of party organizational practice, that then penetrates all important nodes of society, the newspapers, the large companies, obviously the political institutions, and so on and so forth. And from that vanguard position, drags society forward, kicking and screaming into the century of the fruit bat. And if you got that pop culture reference, you're my new best friend. In other words, Leninism presumes rule by a knowledge elite appointed on a sort of meritocratic basis through their mastery of a canon of texts and practices, which again maps on very well to a traditional imperialist practice of meritocratic appointment of officials through mastery of the canon, again, what some people would call the Confucian canon, but a canon of texts, as well as mastery of appropriate rituals for participation in imperial government. Right? Leninism maps on really well onto Chinese imperial practice. And the idea of that ideology is then that through a scientific understanding of the world, we will be able to progress. Now, obviously, there's something really interesting that happens after 1949, when the Communist Party gains control over all of China. For the first 30 years, most of it is a fairly unmitigated catastrophe. Please don't tell Xi Jinping I said that. He would accuse me of historical nihilism. But obviously you have the Great Leap Forward between 1959 and 1961 that kills about 30 million people. You have the Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution lasting about 10 years from 66 to 76 that throws China into complete political, economic, and social turmoil. And at the end of it, when Mao dies in 1976, China is pretty much the poorest country in the world. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that during those first 3 decades of Communist Party rule, you have this constant tug of war on how to interpret the task that we are supposed to do. Is it what Mao wants? The romantic revolutionary who believes in eternal revolution, who believes in continuing to mobilize the people against class enemies? Or is it a group of much more boring, I don't know how many of you have seen Clarkson's Farm already on Amazon Prime, but think about the land manager in that particular television show. A boring cadre of economic planners who want to boringly but competently gradually develop the Chinese economy. And that situation is never really resolved until Mao dies in 76. And then after a couple of years of political struggle, in 1979, you get a new regime run by Deng Xiaoping, very much a pragmatic institutionalist, not a poetic power player like Mao would be. And Deng Xiaoping does something very interesting ideologically. Maintaining the overall shell of ideology, what Deng does is to say, if we want to modernize, we can actually not afford to have this personality cult where, whatever Chairman Mao says is taken as gospel. We need to think scientifically. We need to have our policy questions decided by science. And it is from that point onward that you start seeing economics, social science, political science, and so on take a very, very important role in China's development trajectory. Now here I want to pause for a minute and ask you a question that I was asked when I was first explaining these ideas, when I was starting to come up with how to understand all of this at a conference, where a hand goes up, and the question is, what about the people then? Yes, haven't they been curiously absent so far? What I hope to be able to convince you of is that ideologically speaking, in Chinese Communist Party think, the people don't really have a place. They exist as a source of fuzzy authority, in the same way that the crown exists in British law as a sort of powerless political principle that nevertheless somehow needs to exist as a foundation, but nothing more. But certainly, the idea that government is there to govern by consent, the idea of limited government, consent of the governed, is utterly and completely absent in this strand of political thinking. In other words, the Chinese state should not be limited by legal niceties such as fundamental rights, freedoms. Rather, the Chinese state should be empowered to realize its program of historical progress in a position where, in the words of Xi Jinping himself, China is facing circumstances in the international sphere that have not been seen for over a century. And with that, obviously, it's talking about, to a very significant degree, the crisis in which what the United States, I think untruthfully, but characteristically called the rules-based international order, finds itself. So where are the people? Nowhere. Right? Very often we talk about this with very culturalist arguments. We say that the Chinese somehow culturally are collectivists. I would counter that with the words of Sun Yat-sen, founder of the Chinese Republic in 1911, when he said, the Chinese people are overly individualistic and hang together like a sheet of loose sand. But at least, from the Communist Party perspective, the nation comes first. Again, as Xi Jinping said, only when the nation does well can the individual do well. Now, this was a bit of a roundabout, but I think necessary way to come to the digital space. Because this is where we start to see how the Chinese government might look at the digital world. Now, what I just said about Deng Xiaoping, Deng said we need to think more scientifically. We need to have science guide us in order to identify the circumstances, the challenges we face, and the way that we respond to them. And that led to a very big space in Chinese political intellectual life opening up for a particular version of complex systems theory. And what that idea holds is that social reality, like the natural world, is underpinned by a set of objective scientific laws. And that those laws are intelligible, we can understand them, we can identify them. And once we do understand them, once we have identified them, we can then use those laws not just to predict what is going on, right, in the same way that we can predict when we're going to have the next solar eclipse, but also to control it, right? So in the same way that if you know a little bit about combustion, about trajectories, and preferably oxygen supply, we can get Elon Musk to Mars. The Chinese government, and this is a widely shared belief, believes that society is a complex machine whose functioning can be understood, predicted, and controlled. Right? This is also a really important point. One frequently asked question that I get is China still communist? Or a variation of that, do these Chinese Communist Party officials actually believe in their ideology? And the answer is, of course, China is still communist. Or, no, actually, I get that wrong. China never was communist, it's socialist. At least, that's what it calls itself. The problem is that when we ask communist, what we're really asking is China in any way like the USSR? And of course, it's not. And when it comes to the extent to which officials believe in this, very often, these are loaded questions. What we actually ask is, to what extent can we expect this political organization to collapse? The real answer is they don't necessarily believe in all of it. But if we see ideology not just in, swearing fealty to the person of Xi Jinping and everything that he stands for, but a much more complex global image, a worldview, certainly this idea that society is a machine is a widely shared idea, and it's also very often an idea that is held by dissidents. They do not dispute the idea that society is a machine that can be predicted and controlled. They just disagree with the way in which the current Communist Party is trying to control it. Right? So when we think about things like opposition, think through the different layers of intellectual content and don't simply believe that just because someone happens to agree with you on some points that they are completely on your side. Obviously, the challenge, once you say that society is a machine, we can understand it, we can predict it, we can control it, is good. How are we going to do that then? And perhaps some of you will have read Hayek as a form of self-flagellation, I imagine. But what Hayek argues is, that is way too complex. There is way too much information. That cannot be done. And perhaps Hayek is right, but that hasn't stopped the Chinese government from trying. So in other words, digital technology, from the Chinese government's perspective, is important in one very important area, a couple of areas, but important certainly in the one area that the idea that they have is that digital technology, for the first time in history, creates the data collection potential and the computational power to actually get an accurate assessment of how that social machine works. Because it's an engineering challenge that comes down to the quality of your instruments. To compare with natural science, In the era of Galilei, all we needed was a wooden tube with a glass lens to make major progress in natural understanding of the world. Now we need to dig a 20-kilometer tunnel under 2 different countries under the Alps in order to make the next step forward. You know, the same thing is true from that Chinese perspective. We need a bigger boat, or at least we need a bigger brain, digital brain, in order to realize that mission. But obviously, digital technology isn't just a space for the Communist Party to understand and control and predict society. It is also a space in which Chinese citizens are present. And this is where we do get to the question of freedom. I wrote an article a couple of years ago discussing this notion of a right to free speech throughout the Communist Party's legal history, and one of the interesting documents that I found was a constitutional text of one of the first base areas that the communist rebels, as they then were, conquered in the late 1920s. It's called the Shan-Gan-Ning base area. And this constitutional document had a very interesting provision on free speech. It said, the revolutionary masses in these base areas will have the freedom of speech, and the party will provide them with the material resources to do so. Literally paper, ink, that sort of thing. However, counter-revolutionary elements do not have free speech. And obviously, we are now over 70 years on from the revolution, so it would be an indictment of the party's ruling quality to say that there would still be counter-revolutionary masses. But the conditionality in that notion of free speech, you are free to say that you agree with us, in one line, slightly expanded to you are free to say whatever we do not object to, is still very much present. And the reason for that is clear. There is, the ideology of the Chinese Communist Party is we are progressing towards a utopian future and we do not want people to stop us. And with this, I'd like to turn a little bit more comparative. Because very often what I find is thinking through what China does. As the great Belgian sinologist Simon Leys once said, to write about China is to hold up a mirror to oneself, and I fully and completely agree. I think China is also a useful mirror to think about ourselves in these respects of freedom. And the reason for that is this. As I said in the beginning, we've become intellectually lazy. And we've become particularly intellectually lazy after the end of the Cold War, where we got a bit victory drunk and we believed that we had won. Liberal democracy plus free market capitalism would be the end of history. The rest of the world would come around to see that. There is no alternative. Liberal democracy plus free market capitalism is the only way in which a state can exist, factually, sustainably, and the only way in which a state can be moral. Right? So it's very only democracies can be moral. I invite you to put that position to people who have spent over 20 years in Guantanamo, about 20 years in Guantanamo Bay by now, or indeed First Nations worldwide, or any other victims of Western democracies. But that was the finding. And so the rest of the world would either voluntarily come around to that point of view, or they would not share our values, so they needed to be brought around that point of view the hard way, through regime change. And the problem with that is that we started seeing everything through the lens of regimes, right? We talk about China where particular things happen or don't happen because it's an authoritarian state. And from an academic perspective, that already is an incredibly lazy move, because essentially what we say is there are democracies and then there are non-democracies, but we don't really differentiate, right? China's a non-democracy, North Korea is a non-democracy, Brazil, according to some definitions, is going that way, and so on and so forth. But obviously, that already is a problem because there are many different kinds of democracies, and essentially it establishes democracy as normal and non-democracy as aberrant. This is, of course, historically nonsense. Just to give you an idea of the recency of democracy, women didn't get the vote in Switzerland until about the mid-1970s. And if we think about human rights as a sort of natural heritage of humankind, think about the fact that the last time that France used a guillotine to chop the head off of someone was 1977. And they kept one in working order until 1981. So very many of these ideas that we assume to be natural truths after the end of the Cold War were at that point in time no more than a few decades old and certainly not necessarily well established in Western political practice. And you can ask any person of color who tries to vote in Georgia next time around. However, what we do is we idealize this and we start thinking about freedom, and particularly in the digital space, in a very strongly libertarian sense. Freedom, particularly on the internet, has been very much infected by a libertarian ethos that characterized the initial pioneers, the people who really built the internet. And if you want, a very good example of one of them, not to put him down, he did many, many great things for the development of the technology that we have today, but he was the original addressing system. The original addressing system of the internet was a dude called John, more specifically John Postel. Look up a picture of him, California hippie, long beard, flip-flops, and Hawaiian shirts. Right. This is the sort of person you're talking about. Also think about the Declaration of Independence of Cyberspace by John Perry Barlow, which essentially says that governments have no place in the internet. Right. The internet is a new space for a new kind of person that is not going to be captured by the strictures of the politics of the past. Now, if you are a skeptic about the notion of progress in human nature, right, I do not deny that advances have been made over the last 3,000 years of human existence. Certainly, dental anesthesia is a very, very nice one. But human nature, I will hold, has not fundamentally changed, whatever Steven Pinker might suggest. And so the problem with that is that the moment that people started believing that cyberspace was this space outside of the reach of government, you get a problem with authority, right? And many of the technical means to govern the internet, when you look at ICANN or the Internet Engineering Task Force, are indeed run on the basis of rough consensus. And maybe that works when it comes to engineering, right? Usually in engineering, the tasks, the objectives are relatively well defined, and the trade-offs are fairly clear. So once you identify an objective, you only have a couple of possible solutions, and it's relatively easy to identify one as the one that you're going to pick. But the problem is that people start doing other things on the internet than merely engineering it. And this is where the internet really came to characterize that very interesting post-Cold War end of history period, where we believed that technology symbolized, the Western victory in the Cold War. Technology symbolized the victory of the private sector, of things like, the multi-stakeholder model, the idea that different communities could come together and build the internet. But it also held great political promise. Do you remember when we believed that the internet would bring democracy to the darkest places of the world? Turns out that the promise of the internet has been true. It has generated many new and interesting economic models. Think, for instance, about working conditions in Amazon warehouses. It has also generated all kinds of new models of citizen-driven journalism. Think about Alex Jones and Breitbart, none of whom would have gotten anywhere without the internet and later on social media. The internet would facilitate all kinds of new forms of social organizations for people to meet each other and come together, like ISIS. And I know I'm being a little bit facetious here, but this is essentially the problem with the sort of freedom that we have allowed to develop on the internet. And that is a freedom devoid of government, and a freedom devoid of responsibility and accountability that now goes to the very top of the billionaires who have made incredible amounts of money, sucking value, money, and oxygen out of the rest of global society. Facebook has been complicit in the deaths of thousands of, hundreds or possibly thousands of people in Myanmar, amongst others. When asked about this, Mark Zuckerberg will essentially say that his task is to connect people and not to impinge free speech. Twitter has obviously been complicit in the Trump presidency and its sad high point, the attack on the Capitol in January of this year. Nearly 6 months ago, I remember waking up and the first thing I do was check out what the American president has done. Don't we live in golden days these days? But this is exactly the problem. It is also the problem, if I can just cite you, with Corona. Because the problem is that we've developed a sense of freedom that has become about unfettered individualism. I want to do what I want to do, regardless of the consequences. And so under a Corona period where it is really a good idea for us not to travel, I will damn well go on my holiday because going on holidays is a human right. I will damn well say on the internet whatever I want to say on the internet. Whatever harm it results in, whatever extremization it results in, whatever irresponsibility it results in. And with this, I'd like to flip back to China a little bit. Right. China was never in the position where it won the Cold War or where it could get lazy and complacent. So very many of the difficult questions that technology brought, China actually addressed. And like I said, I do not wish to make the Communist Party's case for it. It can do that itself. And in fact, I do not wish in any way to suggest that I am a fan of the specific solutions to these problems that the Communist Party found, but I do wish to underline that asking the question is important. And one of these questions is indeed, how does one manage information flows in the online space responsibly? Obviously, the Chinese answer we know. We know about the Great Firewall. We know about, the tens of thousands of people who are either censoring stuff that other people put online or putting online party-supported content. I don't think necessarily that is a very good idea. Certainly, it creates its own pathologies. But it does answer a very interesting question, which is, or does try to answer a very interesting question, which is, what are limits on the production and dissemination of content in the online space? Because, in the same way that we can say the existence of people like Alex Jones and Breitbart and whatnot, that's the price you pay for living in a democracy. The flip side is that, the price you gain from living in China is, for instance, there's no climate skepticism, there's no vaccine skepticism, which has actually led to fairly high levels of vaccine receptivity among the Chinese population. The problem that they have is producing them quickly enough and rolling them out. We must not forget this is, after all, still a developing country where a lot of that infrastructure simply isn't there. But it actually tries to answer that question, and it comes in some areas with benefits that, given the fact that we believe that only democracies can be competent, we routinely underestimate the competence that is actually present in the Chinese political system. We see this in other questions as well. The West has always spoken about a free, open, and a free and open internet for the entire world. Well, what then happens if different governments in the world, even if we keep it to democratic governments, have different ideas about how they want this space to be governed? Right. Because what no one seems to have taken seriously is this notion that if you're going to have a free and open internet, you're going to need global government. Or there's not going to be government, in which case there's going to be anarchy. And where this has led, we've seen. So even if, let's say that we reduce the world to democratic governments, North America, Western Europe, Australia, Canada. New Zealand seems to be doing pretty well on the virus. We need, what if we have different ideas about how speech should be governed, right? Germany, for obvious historical reasons, has fairly strict rules on the display of Nazi iconography, which the United States does not. If we believe that the German citizens have a right to democratic control over their cyberspace, at some point we're going to need to figure out a way to delineate German cyberspace. Again, the Chinese got there first. They launched this notion of cyber sovereignty long, long ago as an answer to the question of, that tension, the role of national governments. They got there over 20 years. They got there over a decade ago, nearly 20 years ago. And until fairly recently, if you drop the sovereignty words in, the hallowed halls of the European Union institutions in Brussels, you'd be stared out of the building, or even escorted out of the building. And now we're at the point where European officials are using the sovereignty word themselves, for instance, in relation to the GDPR. We see a similar thing where it comes to data security. Very often when we talk about data protection, what we are talking about is personal information protection. That is really the paradigm that we have, and it's a very important one. However, it overlooks the fact that by now there's a whole bunch of data out there that is not personal information, that is not government information that falls under traditional schemes of secrecy classification, but that nevertheless has a potentially very important impact on national security or the public interest. Again, 2 or 3 weeks ago, China got there first. They published a data security law that actually creates a legal framework to deal with those issues. And again, I'm not arguing that this is a preferable or a desirable specific legal framework, but again, they got there first. And that means that as other countries, third countries, as we like to call them, the G77, as other countries start grappling with these issues, China is the only game in town, in terms of an example. And maybe it's an example of how not to do it. But again, we underestimate the competence that is present in the Chinese political system at our peril. So this is really, and what I believe what this draws down to is to be drawn down to this notion that democracies are inherently superior, that we are superior by virtue of what we are. And I believe that it is a dangerous thing to do, particularly where, as I said, it leads to intellectual complacency, where we no longer think through the difficult questions that present themselves and that really need to be answered. Because look around you, look around our internet sphere. Would you recommend it to anyone right now? And this is really the thought that I would like to conclude with. The question was already asked by the chair in the introduction, but we need to think through what freedom is. And the problem is that I personally believe we need to move away from the very libertarian, highly individualist notion of freedom is I do whatever I want to do, damn the consequences, that we have gotten ourselves into. And we need to do that for a couple of different reasons. And what I do not wish to suggest in any way is that we need to go back to some golden past. Conservatives don't help us here, because the past got us to where we are now. What we actually need to think about is the future. And I would like to suggest that we need to think about a couple of ways. First, in our democracies, we need to get a much more accurate understanding of how enormously important, for starters, economically, authoritarian states have been to us. Over the last 30 years, we lived beyond our means simply because China would make cheap stuff for us. Now we're at a point where politically we don't really want to be that dependent on China anymore, and economically China's getting too expensive, so we're moving it to Vietnam or Bangladesh or other places, not necessarily paradigms of democratic politics. Our welfare is based on not just horrendous economic conditions in a whole bunch of countries in the world, but also on political conditions that we claim to oppose. And it's time for us to become a lot more self-responsible in that respect. Second, we need to think through the health of our own societies. We drove our societies over the last 20 years, 20, 30 years like a rental car, and I'm very aware that I'm a homeowner speaking to a demographic who will probably pay through the nose for having a roof over their heads, even in one of the wealthiest countries in the world over the next couple of decades. And you are still among the privileged among your generations. If you're struggling, imagine what it is like if you didn't have the degree of education that you have all received. 3, and this comes down to the health of our society, freedom needs to come together with a sense of responsibility towards the environment. Freedom must be limited by, the notion to which we exercise our freedom must be limited by a recognition that we can't materially all get what we want. In other words, freedom cannot be the freedom to all own an SUV. But also, freedom cannot be the freedom to be horrendously offensive to whatever group of the population you desire. As a white man, I'm very aware of the fact that I'm a white man. The point is, you know, people who look like me have been getting a pretty good run over the last century or 20. And it is now time to recognize that some people are not men, and indeed some people are not white, and nevertheless, turns out that they're real people, and they deserve to be treated as such. Because the problem with that is that the question is that if you read Pankaj Mishra, and I would very strongly recommend everyone that you do, Pankaj Mishra talks very intelligently about how the concepts of freedom that we have were actually developed in order to create white male privilege over the course of the Renaissance. And lastly, you know, we should not simply assume that we're better. We should in fact assume that we're not. Because only if we do that will we be put in a position where we actually compete with China, where we try to offer a better deal to our own citizens, but also to the rest of the world. Think about technology. What Europe and America are doing now is going to poor countries and essentially tell them not to buy cheap but fairly decent quality telecommunications infrastructure from Huawei, but buy more expensive and not necessarily much better telecommunications infrastructure from Qualcomm, Nokia, and Ericsson. Why? Well, because we really want to kill Huawei stone dead. You know, that's not an attractive message to the rest of the world. If we believe that we are better, if we believe that our ideas of freedom are worth fighting for, let's make sure that they are. And with that, I'd like to thank you for your invitation and your attention.
Thank you, Rogier, for a very interesting talk. Thank you for the questions you asked. Now we move on to questions from the audience. I believe a microphone will be passed towards you. So if you have a question, please could you raise your hand and someone will come towards you. Does anyone have any questions?
Wondering, so when it comes to freedom of speech on the internet, would you suggest that then platforms such as Google, Facebook or Google or Instagram get more power to regulate speech? Or would you rather suggest that like courts make the decision whether there's really like to kind of strike a balance between freedom of speech and hate speech or fake news? Like who's supposed to regulate this?
Who's supposed to regulate this? Well, this is an interesting point. Now, as you may have noticed, I am one of these people who is a committed historicist. If you want to figure out where we are today, you need to look at what we were doing yesterday. And one of the ways in which we got to the modern state was essentially by taking power that resided in private spaces and put it into some new box called the state, which then we progressively put under democratic control in the 17th, 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries. Right, so we took power away from kings and aristocrats and trade guilds and the church, and we put it in the box of the state. We invented this public architecture. I think we are due a new wave of deprivatization of power, and I think that is what is going to happen to the platforms. I don't exactly know what that's going to look like, and the reason for that is I don't think there's going to be one sole answer. Right? What is going to happen is, there are two processes going on, which I call the Great Integration and the Great Normalization. And the Great Integration is where we used to see the internet as something separate from the real world. Increasingly, we're going to see it as something that is integrated into the real world, and we're going to regulate it in that way, right? One stupid example of that is Uber drivers are now employees instead of, some special status by virtue of working for a tech company. The Great Normalization is that those companies are going to be increasingly treated like any other company. So we're no longer going to give them a special aura just because they happen to be run by, tech bros or, the odd tech cis. And unfortunately, the example you always get is Elizabeth Holmes. Now, that's going to happen in different ways in different places, depending on the political system that you deal with. So in the United States, partially because we are at a very high level of distrust vis-a-vis the parliamentary process through Congress, the traditional legislative route, I think that courts are going to play an incredibly important role. Also, obviously, has to do with the fact that the United States is a common law jurisdiction where courts simply have that much bigger role to play. What I believe in Europe is where we are far less skeptical in our political culture about the role of legislators. Look at the way that it's happening with the GDPR. We have the European Court of Justice sort of giving an assist. The Euros are on TV, sort of across in front of the goal, and then with the sort of judicially created notion of a right to be forgotten, and the Commission and Parliament then kicking the ball into the goal with things like the GDPR or the Digital Markets and Services Act package as it's happening now. And I think these are just sort of the opening stages of taking a lot of, on the one hand, decision-making power away from those companies, but at the same time imposing a lot of responsibilities. And obviously that is going to lead to enormously high business cost, and so it should. Again, the Great Normalization, right? Volkswagen has to make different cars for different countries simply because regulatory frameworks differ, right? The United States have different safety requirements, for instance, than the European Union does. And that's going to happen to tech companies as well. Yes, they're going to have to tune their products and services to different national requirements. And that is going to mean that a whole bunch of governments are going to do things that we do not like in the digital space. And that's because a whole bunch of governments do things that we do not like anyway. So for instance, you look at India, very often called the world's largest democracy. The current Modi government is very much not in tune with protecting minority rights in the digital space. And it's going to use governmental power to push tech companies into that corner. And obviously, we don't talk about that very much because we like to see India as sort of the good alternative to China. But that's also something that's going on. These things are hugely complex. But this is where I see the trend line going.
Thank you. That was a very insightful answer. Are there any more questions from the audience?
Hi, thanks for your talk. I liked it. Well, from my understanding, the whole Facebook and Google and the surveillance capitalism and that stuff works primarily because us, the consumers, are not aware of all the data they're collecting. So the data surplus, which is not, as you say, the personal data that's like protected well, we don't know everything that they're getting and what they're doing with it. And even when we try to regulate it, they don't disclose everything, or they lie about it, and then in court it doesn't really matter. So in China, for example, or the future, how much is secrecy of this whole digital age and data collection essential to the mechanisms of predicting and manipulating the society or the people?
That's a very interesting question. Thank you for that. Platform governance in general. Again, I've been talking about the idea that democracies and non-democracies are fundamentally different, and everything that happens in them can be explained on their regime nature. Actually, that isn't true. What we're seeing is that we see the same trends happening in China as here, and obviously they look slightly different because of different contexts, but the overall trend is the same. This is also, by the way, we talk about China growing more authoritarian under Xi Jinping. We can see this as a Chinese phenomenon, but I think we should also recognize that the world has gone more authoritarian. So China's, it's like the water goes up and all the boats go up and down. It's just that China started out from a different place to begin with. And I think something similar is happening with platform governance. Now, you mentioned the notion of surveillance capitalism, which I think is a very useful one. If only that book could have been 500 pages shorter, it would have been a lot more readable. But the notion of surveillance capital is based on the notion that in the end we can sell more stuff to people. Personally, I think one of the biggest pathologies of our society and our age is our addiction to cheap stuff, right? You solve our addiction to cheap stuff, many other problems will solve themselves. But in the meantime, as we are addicted to cheap stuff, we need to market cheap stuff. And so we need better forms of marketing. Now, there's a really interesting book called If Then by the American writer Jill Lepore, and that talks about the early days of data-enabled marketing in the United States, which, it may surprise you, clickbaity remark right there, it may surprise you, started already in the early 1960s, so long before we had the digital economy. And it was all based on this notion that the more you knew about people, the more you could steer their consumption behavior, but also their voting behavior. And this is where we get the datification of American elections from, right? We need to sort of test drive a particular sentence and see how it goes with unmarried, highly educated, single mothers in this particular district. And that's how you target things. And so the promise was always that we can more effectively target your consumers. And this is really what the entire surveillance capitalism model is built on. The problem is that it's bullshit. And sooner or later, it will be discovered to be bullshit. And instinctively, we all know that it is bullshit. I have a daughter who is turning 6 next Wednesday. And she is a princess who is very interested in STEM. So for her birthday, I got her the Lego space station and the Lego Beauty and the Beast castle. And guess what targeted advertisings I'm now getting? I'm getting ads for the very toys that I just bought, right? Very unlikely I'm going to buy these very same toys again. And so really, that's the problem. The problem is, that's half of the problem. Half of the problem is that this is a business model that doesn't really work, and I fully expect at some point that balloon will burst. The other part of it is that it's built on doing stuff that people don't really like. Any one of you enjoy advertising? No, right? Usually, I've been watching the football over the last couple of weeks. The football is interesting to watch, except if it's my country playing Portugal, because, God, we have the best side in the world, but they're not in shape. But the ads in the middle, I like to see myself as a fairly peaceful person, but gosh, they make me physically aggressive in their inanity. But even if they're actually creative and interesting, the problem with advertising is a tool to make you feel dissatisfied and unhappy. And that dissatisfaction and unhappiness can be solved with spending more money on cheap stuff, including things like cheap holidays and cheap experiences, because otherwise you're not a fully fledged existing human being. So advertising makes people unhappy, and it does so, and it makes people unhappy while not even delivering on the promise that it puts. This in and of itself will sort of create a problem with that entire business model. The further problem with that business model is that we haven't really figured out a way to make people pay for these services. And this is the interesting thing that you see in China. Companies like Tencent and Alibaba, where companies like Facebook and Google get over 90% of revenue through advertising. Alibaba gets, with Alibaba and Tencent, it's less than a quarter, and even less than a fifth, I think, because these companies also provide paid-for services. In Tencent case, that is things like gaming, and in Alibaba's case, that is e-commerce. And they also have a lot of subsidiaries that make them money, ranging from ride-hailing to food delivery and all of that. So this notion of surveillance capitalism is less important to these Chinese companies' profit-making model. Nevertheless, it does happen. And again, unsurprisingly, the Chinese government got there first by essentially not necessarily outlawing these forms of automated decision-making, but by requiring companies already in 2018 to make available an opt-out option for all cases of automatic recommendations. So that can be content recommendations, like Facebook or Twitter sort of prioritize your feed, but also things like targeted advertising. And yes, but there are also new limits for that on exactly what they can collect and what limits. Well, the secrecy is all.
Doesn't tell you either that it's collecting all this data and what you're doing with it.
The secrecy is always a problem. But the interesting thing is, part of what I was getting at in my speech is that we, and certainly people who are politically left of political center like I am, we've had a big problem with power and authority. We've been very scared of power and authority, right? We like the state actually not to exist because the state might control people. Well, surprise, surprise, controlling people, controlling society is what the state is for. And the quicker we recognize that, the quicker we can actually try and get it to do so ethically, but also effectively. One of my big frustrations with my political predilection is that we are, right but ineffective. And we need to think about becoming effective very quickly soon. Whatever else one thinks about the Chinese Communist Party, or the Chinese party state, they believe that the state shouldn't or cannot intervene into, for instance, the digital economy, isn't really there. The state will come in, both feet forward, and it will take people down. Look what it did to Jack Ma. Right? It took dozens of billions of dollars away from Jack Ma because personally he got uppity. That's really nice when you want to tell the dramatic story, but also structurally because this is about delivering financial services online. And the Chinese government, as I said, plans to be continuously in power until 2049 at least, therefore can do without unnecessary surprises, can certainly do without a financial crisis, and so what it wants to do is keep the financial system in its box, which we clearly haven't done, which led to 2008, which we didn't solve, and so none of you can afford a house. So, just to compare the place of the digital economy within that sort of overall landscape where, in the end, you have a state whose mission it is to stay in power, and therefore potentially significant risks need to be managed. Whereas here we have a state that we are really skeptical about, or we believe shouldn't intervene, and therefore it doesn't, therefore it is weak and powerless, and therefore we end up in a situation where companies essentially run wild in the way that you describe.
Thank you for your answer and thank you for the question.
You're keeping an eye on the time, right?
I'm afraid I don't think we have
I'm going to stick around for lunch if anyone wants to continue the conversation.
Yes.
But also feel free, obviously you can find my email on my university page. I'm on Twitter, I'm on LinkedIn, I'm on Instagram. Feel free to connect or follow.
Thank you very much. We now move on to our second and third speakers who will be speaking together for the first session. We have Leon Willems, who is from Free Press Unlimited. He is the Director of policy programs, Free Press Unlimited has grown into a broad-based, internationally renowned media development actor working in over 40 countries worldwide. We also have Flora Schulte-Nordholt, who is a policy and advocacy officer at Free Press Unlimited. She will be speaking on digital authoritarianism, and Leon will be speaking on media freedom. Please, the floor.
Hello, everybody. Flora will speak about digital authoritarianism, but I thought that I should start by talking about freedom, because in the end of the day, we're talking about freedom today in a broader sense, and I'll try to elaborate a little bit of how, in my view, freedom, media freedom, and to a certain extent an end to slavery for humankind, are interconnected. I'm mentioning the issue of slavery, of course, because today is Kitty Kotti, which is the Break the Chain Day. Super. Which is, of course, the Break the Chain Day commemorating an end to slavery. And actually, I was asked today, I'm not sure if you got it also, but on LinkedIn there's a petition going, should this be a national holiday, yes or no? I said yes, basically also because I don't really relate anymore to the second day of Pentecost and don't know why we have, as the only country in the world, the second Christmas day, so why not have other days? But let me go in the issue